So, hello everyone. This is actually our second LinkedIn Live event for today, where we're talking about AI risk, especially about systemic risk of AI, what is behind this, how our ideas or maybe fears and misconception about risk in AI have influenced regulation. We're going to talk about the AI Act and regulation and how the AI actually might be driving innovation in Europe. My name is Tristan. I'm the founder of the AI Strategy Institute. I'm a lecturer for AI at the Technical University of Munich and a faculty member for AI at the Boston Consulting Group. And I'm super excited to have Risto here today from the Future of Life Institute. We normally have the tradition that we don't do kind of like a lot of introduction, but ask our people, our guests who come here to introduce themselves. So Risto, please tell us your background. What is the Future of Life Institute, and also kind of like how did you got your way into AI, and please leave yourself a bit of time.
Yeah, John, sounds good. Thanks so much for having me. So maybe I would, continue building upon what you mentioned. So I work at FLI. We were founded about a decade ago. So initially, we worked quite a bit on climate change issues, nuclear security issues, and recently we have shifted a lot more toward AI because we are interested in steering very powerful technologies away from extreme harms and towards very beneficial outcomes. And we currently think that AI has potential to be very transformative in a positive way, in a negative way. So yeah, we have started to prioritize AI quite a lot. But those other topics, nuclear security, for example, also biosecurity, those are still big, important, pressing topics for us as well. Maybe in addition to working at FLI, I could mention that I am a PhD researcher at KU Leuven, where I study systemic risks from general purpose AI. Before joining FLI, I worked for the World Economic Forum on a project about positive AI economic futures. So together with UC Berkeley professor Stuart Russell and economist Daniel Susskind and many other researchers, we thought about a scenario where most jobs could be automated, could be done by AI. What if that happens? Like, what kind of world would we live in? What kind of opportunities would be available for humans in that kind of world? What would be the role of humans? And we interviewed top economists like Darren Acemoglu, Eric Brynjolfsson, Anna Salomons, lots of great economists. We asked them, hey, what do you think is, if we do end up automating most jobs, like what kind of role is there for humans? And we wrote a report talking about different scenarios, different opportunities, different options for humans. Before that, I worked for the European Commission on a project about trustworthy AI assessment list. So this was back in 2018 when the Commission had a group that was called the EU AI High-Level Expert Group. So they were tasked with goal of developing AI ethics guidelines for the EU. And part of that project, there was a specific questionnaire that was developed to help companies guide them through the development deployment cycle. Think about how do you make sure that it's as trustworthy as possible? Ask yourself these questions. For example, did you make sure that your customer knows that they are interacting with a chatbot rather than a human being? Things like that. Lots of questions, lots of support for companies to voluntarily think about how to deploy AI. And my background is in philosophy, public policy, economics. Those are my areas. So I'm not a technical computer science or machine learning researcher or anything like that. I'm much more in social science, public policy, philosophy topics. And I did my master's at the London School of Economics, and mentioned that currently at KU Leuven. I know you're also an alum of LSE. Maybe those are a couple of thoughts to kick us off with.
Yeah, super interesting. So I mean, for those who might be familiar with the Future of Life Institute, I think you made, especially when it comes to AI and a topic when we're talking about systemic risk, a little bit, quite a bit of news, because you started, I think it was it last year or was it already 2 years ago? So something at the beginning when ChatGPT came out, that you had this moratorium where a lot of very significant people in the field of AI. I think you mentioned Stuart Russell. I mean, Elon Musk. I'm not sure if we can mention him still anymore, but he was also part of it. Basically, signed this moratorium that when I think it was ChatGPT 4 or 3 came out, that we at least hold all the developments on these general purpose AI models until we understand the risks better. Maybe you can explain, kind of like directly going into a topic. So what is behind that, and what are we talking about when we're talking about systemic risk of AI?
Yeah. So I think ChatGPT came out November 22 or December 22, if I remember correctly. And this pause letter that you referred to came out in March 23. So like maybe 3-4 months after ChatGPT came out. And yeah, this particular letter called for pausing AI companies to immediately, calling on AI companies to immediately pause for at least 6 months the training of AI systems more powerful than GPT-4. And the idea was that this pause would be used to think more about safety, put a lot more effort into that. It was not, a long-term pause or anything like that, but it was meant to slow down the advancement a little bit, slow down the deployment a little bit, the training of these large models, because of the uncertainty what might happen once we do that, and just amplify a lot more safety research in relation to capabilities research. So we know that a lot of research in these companies is done, almost all of it is done on amplifying, increasing capabilities, but very little resources is spent on the safety part. And yeah, you mentioned Stuart Russell. I can also, there were a lot of people on the list of signatories. So
You will
I
find
think
my name also on there.
yeah, yes. So I think it received like over 30,000 signatures, quite a lot of signatures, and many of these people are very credible academic experts. For example, one name that should be mentioned is Joshua Bengio, who is the Turing Prize winner, and arguably, I think currently maybe the most cited computer scientist in the world, and just like a very good, very credible expert in the field, and many other experts like him. So yeah, that's
So
with regard to the pause letter.
and what is it that they are afraid of? So if you're talking about risk and systemic risks of AI, is there a difference between systemic risk and risk of AI? And what is it that people are afraid of, or are they afraid of, or just cautious?
I can't speak, on behalf of everybody. Everybody might have their own risks that they are concerned about. If you actually look at the EU AI Act, which I've been working on for the last 3+ years, a lot of different risks are in scope of the AI Act, and maybe people focus on different risks. So somebody might focus on the use of AI in hiring decisions. Somebody else might be thinking about employment decisions. Other person might be thinking about surveillance or AI's impact on democracy. A lot of different types of concerns, and everyone prioritizes their own ones based on their background, history, what they care about, how they make the prioritization decisions. But systemic risk, in particular, in the EU AI Act, there's a specific definition in the EU AI Act. So it defines systemic risk as a risk that is specific to the high impact capabilities of general purpose AI models, having a significant impact on the union market due to their reach or due to actual or reasonably foreseeable negative effects on public health, safety, public security, fundamental rights, or the society as a whole, that can be propagated at scale across the value chain. So this basically says, I think, a couple of things. It says it's in relation to high impact general purpose AI models. It's wide scale, large scale, and it has some specific risk components. It's in relation to public health, public security, safety, and fundamental rights. So those are like the specific things mentioned here. And I think maybe compared to some other risks, you could see a difference between individual risks and systemic risks. So individual risk would be, say, a self-driving vehicle accidentally kills one person. That would be individual risk.
Yeah.
You can imagine that.
Or I have a misprediction of an AI tool and makes a mistake, and then I have a disadvantage or something. This would be an individual risk, right?
Correct. And systemic risk would be larger scale. So maybe in the case of the self-driving vehicle example, suppose there was some kind of network of self-driving vehicles that was centralized, managed from like one central point, and all of the self-driving vehicles were, let's say, connected to each other, and you have a hacker who hacks into that network and ends up killing lots of people because of the self-driving vehicles malfunction. That would be like a much larger risk. Like it would be a risk to more people. Sometimes people also like to distinguish between that they would not consider risks to many individual systemic risks. They would want to distinguish a large group of people being harmed from systemic risk in the way that systemic risk can also be more abstract. It can be to institutions, for example. Like if AI destroys democracy, you can't really say that there's like, million people were harmed or something. You can't just aggregate it. It's like the whole institution somehow was destroyed or harmed. So I think another example here with regard to individual risk versus systemic risk would be if AI systems influence, say, one person or a few people or even a group of people to change their votes. Like before we started this meeting, we talked a little bit about politics, and yeah, you can imagine like AI being used to influence elections, influence decision making, but no single individual is really harmed by those manipulations or influence by AI. But overall, if a lot of people change their votes, and let's say a particular leader gets in power who, let's say, doesn't care about democracy or is authoritarian, well, that harmed the whole institution, the whole society, but no individual was harmed through that process by itself.
That's very interesting. So I mean, I have like if you're talking about this, I obviously what comes to my mind is something like Cambridge Analytica is probably one of the case studies where you're referring to, but also maybe to go also in a different direction that you can understand how big this idea of systemic risk might be is where AI is created instead of AI is used instead of making good pharmaceuticals, that you just change something and say instead of having that the medicine has a good effect, you just look at, well, how can I change it so I have the worst outcome and I can create new biological weapons and so on. So this would be also all kind of like systemic risk. How much so also I'm thinking about, I mean, a lot of the feeling I have of what we perceive as risk, especially in the news. And I remember when the moratorium of the Future of Life Institute was coming out, the news were picking it up, and I think the picture that was next to it was a Terminator. How much is kind of like this idea? Also, I mean, now I understand also systemic risk in the way that you define it. How much is not only as a group, but also maybe harm to us as a humanity? How much is this part of systemic risk? So if AI gets at some point vastly smarter than us, do we need to be scared? And is this part of systemic risk?
Yes, I think it is part of systemic risk because it sounds to me very large scale. It could influence the whole society. With regard to kind of, you mentioned Terminator and movies and science fiction and Hollywood and things like that. So I actually, first of all, if you look at the pause letter, I mentioned some names there, the 30,000 plus signatures.
Yeah.
A lot of them are very credible people. They're not scared of AI because of Terminator movies or something. They're they're doing independent thinking, they're rigorous about it, they're reviewing literature, they're speaking with other smart people. So there's lots of things that they consider rather than just relying on a movie. However, I would also basically acknowledge that movies can be very useful and very, very valuable. Like Terminator movie or some other movies can provide valuable input. There are cases where, for example, I think the movie Back to the Future, I think Back to the Future had lots of inventions portrayed in the movie. And I think I saw a news article that claimed that many of those inventions now have actually been invented. So oftentimes that's the case. Movie science fiction can help us see possibilities, see many more things that are possible. And oftentimes what is possible will actually be actualized, will actually occur. Not everything, of course. There might be rules of physics that don't allow something, but I think we should imagine futures more. We should think about what is possible more, including risks. So yeah, I think I would, if somebody says, oh, something is just science fiction, I would say that you're using it as a pejorative, but it's not a pejorative. Actually, science fiction is very useful, very good to help make sense of the world, to help us think, imagine futures. So I also don't, I think if I'm thinking back to like different policy discussions and conversations, for better or worse, maybe it's actually not a good thing. I think this type of science fiction and movies and that kind of culture really doesn't affect these discussions very much, which is actually might actually be a bad thing, not a good thing.
Okay.
So I think yeah, like people might say, oh, we need like only hard evidence of an incident occurring, and that's like the thing that we should use. But I think that's naive empiricism. I think oftentimes we can see that a certain capability, if that exists in AI, it could actually pose certain risks, even if those risks haven't materialized yet. So I think it would actually be good for people to pay attention to science fiction. Of course, that doesn't mean like if science fiction portrays something, doesn't mean that it will actually occur, or it's likely to occur or something. But I think it helps us see possibilities, and that can actually be positive. But I don't think these kinds of types of work of culture haven't really influenced, to be honest. Like I almost never hear anybody talk about Terminator in these kinds of conversations, which could be unfortunate. I would actually pitch Future of Life Institute's work. We have lots of short films that we have commissioned ourselves, or we have organized competitions, contests where people were asked to write stories or create films. And there are many very interesting ones. Like we have a couple of ones about lethal autonomous weapons, slaughter bots. You can look those up. Those are very popular. We had one recent movie called Artificial Escalation, which was great. Recently, there were competitions where lots of interesting ideas were expressed. Like there was one short film that was called The Great Plan, which was about U.S. president involved in super intelligence development, and like that was an interesting one. There was one called Writing Doom. Lots of great things that I would actually encourage people to look into and see if they maybe enhance our horizon, what's possible.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I mean, it leads us also to a different point. How are kind of like these, on the one hand side, these fears and or these risks, how they are influencing then our policy making and also regulation? Because I mean, when I look now at for things such as the AI Act, if I look at the AI Act, a lot of things make intuitive sense why they're in there. And for instance, if you look at prohibited systems, so this is Article 5, and this has been gone live now on Sunday. I fear that behind each of these 8 prohibited practices for AI systems, there is a real use case behind it of AI going wrong at some point, right? So how do you see kind of like is this influencing our policy making and regulation, these systemic risks?
So it is influencing regulation in the sense that systemic risk is covered in the EU AI Act. Some of these risks are mentioned in international documents, international approaches. Like, for example, there was I think like maybe 2 years ago now, or 1.5 years ago, the Hiroshima Code of Conduct for Advanced AI. That one mentioned these types of risks, systemic risks, large-scale risks. There was the report by Joshua Benja that just came out, AI Safety Report, that mentions systemic risks. They don't always talk about the same thing. They might have some overlaps, some differences, but systemic risk definitely is a thing that people discuss and is influencing these policy developments. The other risks that you mentioned, the prohibited AI practices, the high risk list in the EU Act, those obviously have a lot of evidence behind them and are important to consider. And it's great that lots of people are focused on those. But yeah, I think it's also important that people are thinking about larger scale risks. What if things could go wrong even more than maybe in individual cases? How to avoid that? And also, what if things go wrong in different ways? What if, for example, there are certain risks to institutions that are not captured by risks to, I don't know, somebody's employment or education, but actually changes the whole education system or some other? Maybe we should think about those types of risks as well. So I think both are important to focus on.
Yeah.
But yeah, definitely systemic risks are having some impact. The discussions around systemic risk are having some impact.
Yeah, I mentioned you mentioned something at the beginning where you talked about you see a lot of these development when it comes to large language models, and I mean the main part of the AI Act that refers to systemic risk is like systemic risk in often in connection to these large language models, and then there's this threshold of where the EU gets to decide which large language model constitute more of systemic risk because of their general capabilities that they have. And you mentioned at the very beginning that you see kind of like the development of a lot of these large language model providers. They are focused on more this American approach of accelerationism. So move fast and break things. Let's see how we can advance things, and then let's fix issues later on. And I mean, this maybe has led to things where, well, we don't care about IP law or scraping a lot of data from news websites, but we do it anyway. And then once the New York Times comes and sues us, we deal with the problem. So how and then this is compared to where we are in the European Union, where we have a completely different approach, where we say, okay, well, we have to take a step back, more what like in line with the moratorium, and think first, how can we develop AI that is safe for our fundamental rights, for our humanity to live in, and set the rules and the guidelines. And in these rules and guidelines, we develop those things. But this has maybe, I mean, we're seeing now a lot of memes around that all the innovation is happening now in China, in the US and Europe. You probably have seen the meme. The only thing that we have is the bottle with the where the bottle is still screw. You can't completely unscrew it, and this is kind of like the regulation that we're getting. Like, how do you see this? Because you have been very much involved in writing the AI Act.
Yeah, I don't know how much I've been involved in directly writing it. I've been an interest group representative throughout the process, and we have contributed our research and our ideas. But of course, the actual legislative writing has been by the EU institutions themselves. But yeah, I have been involved in that from the beginning. Yeah, one kind of thought that came to my mind when you were speaking was regarding the difference between different countries, different regions. I remember maybe a couple of years ago there was a video that went viral that was at a World Economic Forum event, I think, where an economist working at Microsoft said something along the lines of, we should not have regulation before we have had actual deaths. Like that was the, I'm paraphrasing, I can't remember the exact line, but basically the view was that don't get involved before you actually have really serious harm. And maybe you can justify that in some way, but like it doesn't sound good, definitely, to make it so blunt. Um, yeah, so what you were describing is sometimes called the precautionary approach, precautionary principle, that you don't, yeah, before you deploy, develop technologies, you think what kind of harms there could be. You think about scientifically plausible mechanisms of harm. If you see, you might not have actual probabilities of harm, or you might not know that very rigorously, but you have some scientific plausibility behind harms, then you actually don't go ahead, speed ahead too fast. And I argue we have some scientifically plausible mechanisms of harm. We have some understanding of that. We don't have maybe very large scale incidents. We have some incidents even with large language models. There have been suicides committed that have some type of relation with large language models. We could have some type of institutional impacts which are very hard to measure. Lots of people, there have been discussions around how, I don't know, half of the content on social media is like large language model driven. LinkedIn, everybody just uses LLMs. There could be institutional impacts that are very hard to measure, but could already be happening. But with regard to innovation, maybe I would point us toward, first of all, talking about, in the case of the EU Act, which is the most comprehensive regulation in the world, and the EU is taking slightly different approach with maybe some other regions. What was the actual goal of the regulation? Like, they are very clear about the goal in basically when you open the AI Act text, like you immediately see the goal there. And it says the purpose of this regulation is to improve the functioning of the internal market by laying down a uniform legal framework, in particular for the development, the placing on the market, the putting into service, and the use of artificial intelligence systems in the Union, in accordance with Union values, to promote the uptake of human-centric and trustworthy AI, while ensuring a high level of protection of health, safety, fundamental rights, as enshrined in the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU, including democracy, the rule of law, and environmental protection, to protect against the harmful effects of AI systems in the Union and to support innovation. This regulation ensures the free movement cross-border of AI-based goods and services, thus preventing member states from imposing restrictions on the development, marketing, and use of AI systems unless explicitly authorized by this regulation. So you can actually see a lot of innovation language in this particular paragraph. And I think, yeah, in my view, it's very clear that the AI Act is very largely about innovation. There is an issue in the EU, which is fragmentation. There are 27 member states. Everybody has their own language, their own custom rules, norms. It's so difficult to scale up. That's one of the issues in the EU. It's very hard to scale up as a company. It's hard to offer services to other countries. And I remember seeing some lines, maybe it was in Estonia or somewhere, that I remember saying things like, it should actually, like, you should not have to do more paperwork. Once you have done paperwork in your member state, in order to sell it somewhere else, you should not have to do any more paperwork. It should be like very easy. And I think some of these harmonizing regulations that are trying to apply uniformly across the whole EU institution, the European Union, the goal is to make it simpler to do business. And you could potentially see issues in the US as well if the US, for example, ends up creating certain regulations in only certain states. You could have certain similar types of issues. You could have fragmentation. If you introduce legislation in California, which was recently, for example, there was a safety and security bill that was eventually rejected, but could have been introduced and could have been passed. You would have California have an AI law, but no other state. You could actually end up having that kind of issue. And I think the AI Act tries to remove or reduce that kind of problem.
Yeah, before we go, because we definitely want to talk about innovation. Before we talk more about innovation and how the AI actually might be empowering innovation, I want to go a step back and ask you, is the AI Act enough to address systematic risk of AI? Does it a good enough job, or can one single piece of regulation never do this, and we need to do much, much more in order to address systemic risk?
Yeah, that's Great question. Very difficult to know exactly. Obviously, with the AI Act, for example, we just passed it, and the first requirements are just coming into force. As you mentioned, they just came into force, the prohibitions. And there's like so many other things coming up. There's the general purpose AI rules come up in August. From August, they apply, and then you have more high risk AI system requirements coming up later. So it takes quite a while to see the effects, and then we will know better whether it actually mitigates these risks and whether it enhances innovation or doesn't enhance innovation. Like all of these, many of these answers come up. We will know later. So it's very hard to know. My intuition is that no, it's very unlikely that like a single piece of regulation. I also think it's unlikely that if the EU regulates and other places don't regulate, that it's unlikely that it will help mitigate all of these risks. But it is promising that some other places have regulations. China has some generative AI and some specific AI application regulations. South Korea recently introduced their Basic Act, which has a lot of similarities with the AI Act. Brazil is, I think, finalizing some work on this. So there are some places that are doing this work, and I think that's a very positive thing. And the US has been somewhat close to passing some regulation. Recently have been setbacks in that sense. Yeah, I think that would be an improvement. Maybe it would be an improvement to have concrete international AI governance approaches as well. So that would improve. I think it is important also to take a look at some other legislation that already exists. Maybe the whole regulation package overall could manage systemic risk better. There's like Digital Services Act, it has some language around systemic risk. There are things like Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, which relate to some of this. So there are a bunch of different regulatory initiatives that could also help with systemic risk. So I'm hoping that the whole package together can help.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm not under the illusion that like this is enough.
Yeah. I mean, it's very similar to what I always say in my course as an example is it's very similar to the regulation when it comes to driving. Obviously, we have regulation when it comes to driving, but there's so much more needed to kind of like reduce the harm through accidents in driving. That is just kind of like regulation where we hold everyone kind of like accountable, where we hold the people accountable that they have to get a driver's license, where we hold our hopefully state accountable to make sure that our roads are built in a safe way, but also the developers of cars. And I think this needs to be a discussion that goes over the pure legislative act, where we are in discussion and think about, okay, what are the responsibilities we collectively have and the different stakeholders have in addressing the systemic risk? Because I mean, at the end of the day, we probably hopefully agree that we want to develop AI that is really in our interest and doesn't generate kind of like first, second, or third grade effects of harm, or doing something similar to what we now see, what are now all the negative side effects with social media. Now we talked a little bit, or we talked a bit about the risk and systemic risk and regulation. I want to understand, because this is when we talked beforehand, you are a big defender of this idea of innovation of the AI Act, and that the AI Act actually can empower innovation. I mean, you said, you read to us what is the purpose of the AI Act, and in there, quite a bit engraved, is innovation. If you work with organizations or even, I mean, I built up one of the largest startup incubators, they always say, okay, or the first critique is it's harming innovation. It's not innovation friendly. I mean, I have my own hypothesis why I believe the AI Act will empower innovation, but I would be very curious to understand, what do you tell those people when you are on stage and you hear kind of like this regular argument? But I mean, I think the AI Act is actually harmful to innovation.
Yeah, great question. So I think firstly, I would try to reflect a bit on what even is innovation. Like, what do we mean by innovation? I think it's not straightforward. A lot of people, it seems to me, that I basically assume that innovation equals any economic activity. I was like, that's clearly false. Like, you could, for example, sell cocaine to my 5-year-old daughter, and that would be economic activity. that would not be innovation. That's like make everything worse. That would not be good. So I would like recommend people to just think a little bit more about what do we mean by innovation. Clearly, innovation assumes enhancing the well-being of people, producing products, providing services that enhance well-being of people, and that has some ethical considerations, ethical questions. What types of products and services enhance well-being? Not everything enhances well-being. You could take a perspective that let's have the consumers decide themselves entirely, always. Well, yes, that's reasonable, but sometimes companies might use practices that are very hard for consumers to make rational decisions about. So maybe I go to a shop, and restaurants know that you will buy more food if you can smell the food from far. And then you go in and like you're immediately hooked by some good smell, and then you will go and buy. And afterwards you're like, actually, like I had like a lunch right before this. Like, why did I buy like another piece of food? Was that innovation? That wasn't innovation. That was actually harmful for the person because they were not able to use their rational decision making abilities. So I would recommend us to really reflect on innovation. What do we mean by that? And then I think the discussion becomes more complicated, more nuanced. When something hinders an economic activity or throws some constraints toward economic activity, for example, through documentation or through requirement to get approval or through requirements to do some testing, that does not equal harms innovation. That's like too easy. We now have to discuss more with regard to whether that those constraints, whether they're leading to worse outcomes in terms of products and services being released to the market. Are some humans not gaining access to products and services that are actually overall very beneficial and increase well-being? And that could be the case. Regulation could have those kinds of impacts. If, let's say, we have really strong evidence that self-driving vehicles are extremely safe, and they actually are much safer than people driving cars themselves. And you mentioned earlier, thousands of people die from car accidents, arguably due to human decision making being really bad. Well, that would be a negative way to put it, but like a bunch of monkeys driving around, like making random decisions, and like that's not good for anybody's well-being. But yeah, if you have evidence that self-driving vehicles are much safer, and we have regulation that doesn't allow self-driving vehicles to be put on the market in those kind of situations, well, that would be very good evidence in favor of the point that the regulation hinders innovation in this particular case, right? Because we could save lives, we could reduce harm, and we're not doing that because of regulation, if that was the case. So I think there are examples where there's evidence you could point to. There's like arguments, considerations that you could point to that do indicate the regulation can hinder innovation. But it's not so easy that just to say, oh, this increases documentation, hence it hinders innovation. Like, come on, that's like too simplistic of thinking. No, actually, maybe like if we have actual drugs being developed that could kill people, maybe we want some documentation, maybe we want some clinical trials, and we don't have any of those on AI. Like people are creating potentially like some of the most powerful technologies in the world right now, and they don't have to do anything. You have more requirements when you, I don't know, sell sandwiches or ice cream or whatever. Like that doesn't make sense, right? Like we have very advanced data systems that could influence everything. Surely we should consider what kind of documentation, what kind of tests they should do, and many other things.
Yeah. Well, something I realized, I mean, when I speak with the organizations and they say, okay, well, they criticize the AI Act a lot. I normally ask them, well, who of you has actually read the AI Act? And then most people who criticize the AI Act haven't even read the AI Act. And the more I work with the AI Act, the more work I do on the AI Act, the more I realize kind of like this idea that it should drive innovation, and a lot of things are written in a way where you get the main idea and the main message. But at the moment, it's for a lot of kind of like these SMEs, the backbone of our economy. it often seems more of a burden that the AI Act is coming. And I want to mention this because one of the things that I actually use the most when working with the AI Act to really help to understand the AI Act, but also explain people to the AI Act, is actually something that comes from you. I think the Future of Life Institute is involved, is the AI Act checker. And I would love to kind of like talk with you a little bit about this. Maybe before we do this, for the people that are listening to us, if you have questions, if you have comments, put them in here so you can ask, and we will try to address them. But in the meantime, maybe you can talk a little bit more about this. I mean, you can even share your screen and show a little bit of the background behind it and how to navigate it and what was the idea of this. I think it's called the EUAIAct.com, right? So the AI
yes,
checker.
Yes. So Artificial Intelligence Act .eu, I think.
Yeah.
If I'm correct. Yeah. So before I jump to that, regarding this interesting comment that you made that nobody even reads the AI Act, or like not many have read it. For those who have not read it or might not know everything about it or many things about it, it might be interesting for you to know that there are actually sections that are measures in support of innovation. There are actual like innovation related measures there. And some of those are supporting small and medium enterprises, because that's, as I read to you, that's actually the goal of the AI Act. So, for example, Article 62, which is about measures for providers and deployers, in particular small and medium enterprises, including startups. And that one, for example, provides a bunch of provisions for member states to help these smaller companies. So, for example, one requirement for member states is to provide SME startups and priority access to AI regulatory sandboxes. So sandboxes are regulatory environments where you can test your AI systems and you can have access to support and guidance in terms of whether your AI system follows rules well, and like what should you do before you actually properly deploy it in the real world. That's arguably could be very beneficial. Another thing that is required is organize specific awareness raising and training activities on the application of this regulation, tailored to the needs of SMEs and startups. Another one that is actually can be supportive, can help, can reduce costs. There are many examples like this, and I would recommend people to check out these articles, not go with the vibes that, oh, AI Act is like hinders innovation and there's like nothing good. Okay, like take a look at these and think for yourself. Like, is it all bad? Maybe some of these things could be helpful for you. So I would mention that. Regarding the Act website, we also have a EU Act newsletter, which now has almost 40,000 subscribers. Every 2 weeks, we provide people with updates on the AI Act. So the AI Act was passed, but the AI Act is not finished in any way. There's like a lot of guidance being developed. There's secondary legislation, code of practice, all kinds of things still being developed. So I would, if people are interested in seeing those developments, check out their website and the newsletter. Yeah, on the website, I think we started that probably like somewhat early in the AI Act negotiation process. Initially, the goal, I think, mainly was to track the developments in the AI Act. So we have a lot of stuff there around, and if people want to open up Artificial Intelligence Act .eu, feel free to do that. And
maybe you can also, I'm not sure if you can share your screen. I think there would be the possibility.
Let's see if that's possible. 1 second.
So you can show and tell.
Let me check. Not so easy. I think I need to get my MacBook is super secure, so no possibilities like that. Sorry about that. So, but yeah, if people want to like check out the website, if I haven't, I think a lot of people have already checked the website probably because we have more than 1 million unique visitors. So quite a lot of people have already play with it and regularly use it. But yeah, for example, initially the goal with the website was to upload official documents from the parliament, from the council, from the commission, so that people who were tracking the AI Act closely could gain access to those documents, have a central place where you could just check out, hey, like, what was this position that the URI committee in the European Parliament adopted? Or like, what was the whole position of the European Parliament on the AI Act? So you can take a look at those types of things. They are under context. If you check the Windows, there's analysis and the documents section under context, where you can see a lot of this kind of historical stuff. But then over time, we wanted that to be a resource to share more information with people interested about specific topics, like standards. There's a lot of standards development that is happening in parallel to the AI Act, and now after the AI Act. What are standards? Like, what are those? Like, how does the standardization process even work? So we wrote a piece on standards. And compliance checker, you mentioned the compliance checker. This is basically a tool that helps give some initial information about whether you might have any requirements under the AI Act. You can ask it, what is your specific system and what is the use case? And it will tell you, hey, you might have requirements under the AI Act, or it doesn't look like you might have requirements under the AI Act. It's by no means replacing your legal advice or working on the AI Act text yourself or anything like that, but it could give you some very quick guidance. Hey, is my AI system entirely excluded from the Act, or like might it be included, and maybe I do have some kind of requirements under it? So just a very quick understanding around that sense. Also, another tool that we have is the AI Act Explorer, which I would recommend people to check out. You can search for very specific things in the AI Act. The AI Act whole text is long and lengthy. You might not always be interested in specific things. For example,
let's maybe use an example now. So on the 2nd of February, so the first parts have been going live. So you could check. Okay, well, what does this mean? So I think where do we find the timelines again? I don't know, but we could check kind of like penalties. A lot of things. So the things that are going live now are chapter 1 and 2. So the general provisions, they're just kind of like the definition. And I love this kind of like AI Act Explorer because it's so easy to understand. And it says, okay, well, in theory now what has been going live is AI literacy, and you get kind of like these nice summaries. So for those people who are not familiar with this tool, it's an amazing tool to navigate the AI Act and understand what it's about. Also now what is prohibited is actually using prohibited systems. And you can see here this kind of like this whole part of the EU AI Act, and you can get this high-level summary to understand, well, what does it mean prohibited system? So prohibit certain use cases of artificial intelligence, which kind of use cases that are a harm to my fundamental rights and so on. And you can ask yourself, because a lot of organizations that are now providing, for instance, AI literacy training, say if you don't have AI literacy, will you get punished? And then it's a very easy thing to see. You can go to penalties and see. If you go to penalties, and you would see this, is you would see somewhere that actually non-compliance only with Article 5 or Article 16 and so on will be punished, and not Article 2, that is AI literacy. So it's a very helpful way to really understand what is being said, and this is what I like about this tool.
Nice, yeah. Thanks so much for that. Yeah, you can search for very specific things. Like earlier, we talked about systemic risk. Like maybe you're interested in systemic risk. Like, put the keyword systemic risk in. You will find that being mentioned in Article 3 about definitions, Recital 110, Article 55 about obligations for providers of general purpose AI with systemic risk. Yeah, you can find very specific things there as well. If you only care about something, AI literacy, you mentioned, like, type in AI literacy or prohibit AI practices, type that in and check out that specific part.
So we have one question from Klaus, and he asks, even if the EU AI Act explicitly ignores military purposes, how does it deal with gray areas like arms manufacturers to construct tanks or ammunition? I mean, I think also maybe in more general, I think there are some things in the AI Act that are very clear, and then there's some cases that are very difficult to say where they fall in there. So maybe this question goes along this line. So how do I deal with these these cases where I'm just not sure where it would fit in the AI Act?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think military, exclusion is an important topic. First of all, I really don't know. I didn't study this very much. I followed it a little bit for the newsletter, and there are many people who know this space much more and have tried to interpret, have thought about kind of gray areas, things like that. So I would recommend, maybe if you want, take a look at the newsletter and search in the newsletter. I have covered, I think, a couple of times some military exclusion things there, so you can find some discussion around this topic. For example, there was ECNL, I think, one organization that did study this a bit, and there have been some other stakeholders involved. So I would recommend to check that out. I think that is actually generally an important topic, because it might be the case that these are examples where the AI Act does not serve innovation in the best way. So one thing that is important for innovation, or possibly quite important for innovation, is legal certainty, knowing what exactly you might get fined for, knowing exactly what is in scope, what isn't in scope. And there are some cases where it's quite difficult to interpret whether something is in scope or not. I think this is an opportunity for secondary legislation and guidance being developed by the EU AI office. And so hopefully they will offer some guidance on what does military exclusion actually mean, what is excluded, what isn't. Right now, we are actually waiting, I think, for guidance on prohibited AI practices, which came into force. And some stakeholders are very annoyed by the fact that they don't really have a lot of guidance on what types of systems actually are prohibited. So that's an example where I think the EU office needs to have more capacity, more people hired, more funding, more resources to do this work properly, provide this guidance, so that we would have answers to these questions. Because I'm not the one who needs to answer all of these questions.
Yeah, this is an interesting point. This is also one of the critique points that I have in kind of like, when you think we have now the AI Act, and this is one part, and then the big challenge is what are we going to make out of this AI Act? So how are we going to put this in practice? And then we have these authorized bodies. I mean, the central body is the EU AI office, and then in each country you have these authorized or notified authorities, I think, and they can claim then these not notified bodies. I mean, we could now go in the AI Act Explorer and figure out what is actually the provision and
market surveillance authorities and all that stuff.
And I mean, most of them, even though that the AI Act is now live, haven't been set up. And I think the requirement, the timeline for them being set up, I think is 2nd of August this year. So there's still a lot of guideline missing. But also one critique that I'm having, if I'm looking at the staffing of the AI office in the European Union, is like there's no provision for really kind of like for practitioners. So they're looking for policymakers, legal experts, and maybe high-level researchers, but not from any kind of like practitioners from the field that have the experience, how it might be the status quo, what might be the fears and the practicality of SMEs adopting the AI Act. And this is something that I see very critical, because this creates this blind spot where we try to provide guidance for SMEs, but we never really speak to SMEs, and we don't understand what are the problem. Or similar with startups, like how do you see this, and what can we do in order to overcome this?
I agree with you. I think this can be a big problem. I'm hoping that I think recently the AI office was hiring for policy officers and legal officers, and I think, though that hiring round has in its scope to also hire practitioners, I think there's nothing completely opposed to that possibility. It depends on whether that title will actually attract those practitioners. Might not, right? So that they might not have the right people in the pool. But I agree with you. I think they should try to find those people as well. What are some options to improve the situation? Well, hire those people explicitly. Maybe have one round where you maybe call the hiring round AI practitioner or something like that. You could do that, of course. But SMEs oftentimes are very bandwidth constrained. They really don't have a lot of bandwidth to work on these things as well, which also leads to the issue that they have never read the AI Act and they will go by memes of like AI Act hinders innovation because they don't have time to do that. But yeah, ideally, we would have policymakers speak with SMEs much more. There are some associations that can support with that. So Digital SME Alliance, for example, and these kinds of networks of representatives, associations that can support those smaller actors that don't have that voice themselves. The same is with nonprofits or civil society organizations. Citizens themselves cannot speak with policymakers. They don't have the bandwidth to do that. They don't have the access. They don't have the ability. But then you can have nonprofits represent them and support them and be that interest group. I think the same can be the case with startups and SMEs. So yeah, I would be in favor of a lot more effort by policymakers to meet with SME representatives rather than only like big tech companies. Not only big tech matters. SMEs matter quite a lot to the EU.
Yeah. By the way, here's another question, or not really a question, but a comment, and we can maybe spin it into a question for Matthias Klaus. So he says there's so many companies out there offering certificates on the EU AI Act and governance. It sure becomes an industry in itself. I mean, I believe when we're talking about innovation, this is also a big part of what we're going to see in innovation is kind of like that we will have an industry that is creating out of these around these regulation things. But is this the innovation that is beneficial or the innovation that we want or need?
Yeah, there are these jokes and memes. Yes, of course, the AI Act leads to innovation. There's like a bunch of lawyers that we now have to hire. So I would, first of all say, okay, earlier you didn't want to make any judgments about what type of innovation is good innovation. You just wanted basically economic activity to count whatever the economic activity is. Whether you want to sell oil and destroy the environment, that's innovation. Like as long as we can make a profit, or like you don't want to switch to electric cars, you want to have for fossil fuels used for that. Yeah, that's innovation. Who cares? So, but now when it comes to lawyers, like you make a judgment about whether lawyers are valuable for society or not, and like who is valuable. Well, I think actually, in my view, it is an important question. Like, what kind of innovation do we want? For example, one critique about the EU is our richest companies are luxury companies. They're not like tech companies. They're like selling perfumes. Is that the innovation we want? Is a perfume like a really important thing that citizens need to enhance their welfare and well-being? Well, no, it's like the top of the, you go for perfumes when you have everything else covered, right? Like you go for the most expensive clothing when you have everything else covered. So I agree with the criticism that like we need to think about what type of innovation we actually want. But yeah, I think it's probably useful to have a lot of stakeholders involved supporting companies comply, supporting companies figuring out what they actually need to do. Like that seems beneficial, right? Like it's useful to provide those services, and I think it will become sort of an industry itself.
Yeah, very interesting. Now that we slowly coming to an end, we have less than 2 minutes left. So I want to give you the opportunity again, maybe to mention something that you would hope for, wish for the next years to come when we're talking about AI security risk and all the stuff we talked about.
Yep, definitely. So maybe from the perspective of AI safety and innovation, one thing that I would really want when we talk about innovation is to try to reflect on what types of red tape we actually want to remove. There is some red tape that is important to remove, and I would be very much in favor of having those discussions. And if we know very certainly or confidently that something hinders the important innovation that we do want, let's try to get rid of that. So I would have some very simple proposals or simple examples. When you start a company in Estonia, you can do it online in 10 minutes and you have a company in Estonia. I did it. I had a company in 10 minutes. I asked my friends help for like a couple of questions and I had a company. That's not so easy in other member states in the EU. And this also shows that it's not an EU thing. It's a member state thing. You are from Germany. You can tell me more about how difficult it is to set up a company in Germany. I think it's probably quite difficult. You probably will not be able to do that in 10 minutes online and paying 150 euros. You probably pay more. It takes longer. and so on. So that's an example. Let's remove those pointless middlemen. You don't have to get like a stamp of approval. Like if you're, I would recommend to focus on that, for example. That would be one of my wishes. Like, let's make sure that we have safeguards for very powerful AI systems that we are developing and deploying to hundreds of millions of people. Let's have some safeguards. Let's have more safeguards than we have for like, cooking sandwiches and selling sandwiches. Let's have the proper safeguards, because this could be really, really powerful and just transformative. Let's not try to remove safeguards from companies that, or requirements from companies that are extremely rich. Like they want to spend 1 billion on training the next AI model. Let's not remove safeguards on those types of initiatives, or let's not remove requirements on those types of initiatives. But let's make sure that like actual simple things that are potentially not so risky don't have many requirements. Like that would be my wish. If you want innovation, let's make starting a company simple. Let's make it difficult to do $1 billion training run to replace all humans in the world, all jobs in the world. Like, let's not make that simple. That would be my wish.
Yeah, perfect. Risto, thank you so much. Thank you for your insights. I think they were super valuable, very interesting, the work that you're doing, be it on systematic risk, but also on the AI Act. And we're going to share the links also in the recording of the video. For those who have participated, thank you so much for your lunchtime. I hope it was well worth your time, and we wish you a good rest of the day. So goodbye.
Thank you.